Thank you for listening to Lending Thoughts, sponsored by Rocket Pro. Today I'm joined by Chris Colasanti, Vice President here at Rocket Mortgage Canada, one of our founding team members, also a great friend. And we're going to be having a conversation that actually dives a little bit outside of the typical mortgage conversation today, but I think it was well worth it. Chris and I touch on a lot of philosophical topics. We talk about team building. We talk about how to build the organization that you want, and mostly we talk about how to make sure that you have the right people inside of that organization to achieve your ultimate mission. You're not going to want to miss this if you're out there building your business. Have a listen today to Lending Thoughts. Thank you. Today I'm joined by Chris Colasanti. Chris Colasanti is Vice President of Strategy and Analytics and a member of our management team here at Rocket Mortgage Canada. Chris, thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Bekim. It's my podcast debut.
Oh, beautiful. And made even more fun by the fact that instead of me doing the usual question asking all the way through, which I do plan to ask you some questions as well, I plan to have a collaborative discussion, but on this one, we're going to actually switch it up and you're going to interview me. You okay with that?
Sounds good.
All right. So we have a question that we usually start with about life stories, but I'm going to turn it over to you. We're going to get going and we'll see how this goes.
Sure thing. So, Bekim, you've got to ask this question a couple times. So tell us your life story in 60 seconds.
I never thought you'd ask. Thank you so much. So born and raised in Dearborn Heights, Michigan, just on the other side of the border from where we are today, as we talk to you live from Windsor, Ontario. I had two very hardworking parents, two brothers and a sister, very busy, eventful household. My mother worked in the automotive industry, and my father owned a landscaping company from the time I was pretty young. I started working for my dad when I was 11 years old. In many ways, just, on the ground floor, working outside, doing landscaping, shaped a big part of who I am today. Met a girl from Windsor in 2006. Started working for a company named Quicken Loans.
I've heard of it.
Yeah. A couple people have now. And in 2012, started out as a mortgage associate, mortgage banker, director of mortgage banking, grew my way through the direct consumer channel in that business, and then was part of a lucky group that started what's now known as Rocket Pro TPO. And in 2014, I moved to Canada, where I started a family. Now I have two amazing children as well. And in 2019, was part of a small little discussion that eventually turned into the idea, concept, and the business that became known as Edison Financial, now known as Rocket Mortgage Canada today. So that's me in a nutshell.
All right. I was probably just a touch over 60 seconds, but not bad. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask Bekim, for those of you that are listening, Bekim is wearing a Rocket Pro shirt. It has the hashtag BITMFL or BITMFL. I've got to ask, what is BITMFL?
Well, Chris, as you are also sitting here next to me wearing a shirt that says Eat, Sleep, BITMFL, Repeat, BITMFL means bring in the mother effing loans.
Provocative.
It is very provocative. But what that is it's an internal saying with our team when we're sort of, joking around, being lighthearted with the idea of our job is to bring in revenue for this organization. The way that we bring in revenue is we bring in mortgages and we ultimately help clients when we do that. But bringing in mortgages solves a lot of problems for a lot of people and helps build this business.
And you touched on team, and it's a piece of our culture, this sort of BITMFL, as, often things like sayings or stories or traditions, really help form a culture and a team. You've built several teams in your career, both, Rocket Pro in the US, Rocket Mortgage Canada, Edison Financial as we started, and then again, Rocket Pro in Canada. So why don't you lend us your unfiltered thoughts on building a team?
I appreciate that question. So I could probably go on for hours just talking about this because it truly is my life's work. It's the way that I like to attack the world every single day is through the mindset of how do we build teams? How do we build humans? In so doing, how do we build ourselves? And I think the most important thing is to start with the who over the what or the how. And I think most people actually start with the idea first and don't actually give enough thought to the team. I have a lot of different ways that I think about this, and we can wrap on for a little while. But I think the best summarization I've ever heard is a quote from a restaurateur, an entrepreneur named Danny Meyer. And he says, your culture is the sum of the behaviors that you celebrate minus the behaviors that you tolerate. And I felt like I spent so much of my life trying to like capture this into a single quote or saying. And to me, what that really means is have fun with the things and celebrate the things that you want to see happen. And don't be shy, be kind, but don't be nice about the things that you're unwilling to accept culturally. And sometimes it means that everybody in the world doesn't get the opportunity to work with you. And you have to be okay with that. You have to know what you stand for. You have to be honest with yourself. And you ultimately have to build a team and a culture that aligns a mission to a certain group of people, starting with that who. And it's amazing if you start with the right who, how you can go and pick any what, essentially. Dan Gilbert, our co-founder, chairman of Rocket Holdings, and everything that we have to be so grateful for today. He started this business with his brother and a couple of other partners. And I still think about the team that Dan built, the culture that Dan built, the society that Dan built. Like that is still very much ingrained in the organization that we have. And in many ways, a lot of what we do, a lot of what I've done is really built off the back of an original mission, an original culture. And Dan used to say, like, we could go sell shoes and it wouldn't matter. Like our culture stands the test, whether we're selling shoes, vacuum cleaners, or mortgages. And it's so true, because now you look at a company in our, Rocket portfolio, like StockX, for example, and StockX does just that. They sell shoes on the internet, and they've gone on to sell a whole bunch of other things. But at the core of everything that we do is culture, it's teams, it's people. And I like to start by thinking of the people first, and I let the business sort of solve for itself after that.
Yeah, and I think there's a quote, which is that like, you don't build a business, you build people or a team, and the team builds the business. And so one thing I want to tug on is, a bit of a controversial topic, as I do. How do you think about diversity in the early stages of building a team? And I'm not talking about diversity in terms of gender diversity or racial diversity. I'm really talking about like diversity of thought. How do you think about that in the early stages of forming a team?
That's a great question. I think that the best way to start a company is with people who agree with you at about 80% of what your beliefs are, and really to try to align those values. Most importantly, values about how things get done. So I'll give you an example. If you're the type of person, you're the founder of a company or co-founder, whatever it is, and you're putting together a team, and you're the type of person who wants to get things done fast, and fast is in your DNA, and you believe in, fast execution, test, iterate, improve, launch and learn, and your co-founder or other members of your team or, I like to move slowly so that I can make, really, really good decisions, a higher percentage of the time type folks. There's nothing wrong with either. And both can be extremely successful in any space. But imagine in the early days when you're literally hair on fire, there's a million things going on. There's actually hundreds of decisions to be made on a daily basis. And you're not culturally aligned as to how work gets done. One person's trying to move fast, the other person's trying to move slow. I could tell you it's not going to be very long before those two things start to press against one another. So when you talk about diversity, yes, be open to everything, socioeconomic backgrounds, gender, race, etc. Don't care. Flush that stuff aside. Work with the best people. You want to work with the smartest people, period. Whatever that looks like, doesn't matter. Most important thing is, and I've thought about this a lot, if I were starting another business today, the first thing that I would do is I would actually write down what the company stands for, what I stand for, and I would probably interview solely based on those values. I wouldn't even want to see your resume. I want to know who you are before I find out what you are. And I like to think about this in a little test that I call the building manager test. And, most people that I associate with in the day-to-day, they've never actually managed a building before and thought about it like a business. But let's just say, the apartment complex across the street, Chris, for example, you might not know anything about construction. You might not know anything about building maintenance, but I would trust you with my whole heart to go and manage an apartment complex for me. Why? Because I know that you believe in moving fast. I know that you believe in bringing in the right people in and around you. I know that you quickly identify your strengths and you want to fill your gaps as fast as possible. I know that you have a mindset for solving things with technology and implementing efficiencies right out of the gate. All those things hold true whether you're running Amazon, a mortgage business, or an apartment complex. Mm-hmm. So I actually don't care as much about the what. I do care about the who. And then I move on to the core set of values. And from there, I think you start to build a good team. And I'm going to actually throw this one back at you, if you don't mind. You started with me and the team basically right after launching Edison Financial 4.5 years ago. What were some of your early first impressions of the organization? And you've taken some of them and you've made them your own, but also at the same time, many of them were just beliefs and values that you held deeply. So what were some of those values that you think you held coming in, and how are those values evolving as time goes along?
So when I started with Rocket, or what was Edison 5 years ago, I was very early on in my career. I've learned a ton in the last 5 years. I think my philosophies have evolved, but there's certain core things that I think have remained that, if I were building a team, that I would look for. A couple of them you mentioned, but you have to make sure that the people that you surround yourself with are philosophically aligned. If there's no philosophical alignment, or at least, the majority of your philosophies are aligned, your business will just stall out. You'll never build anything. You'll never get off the ground. You'll spend the majority of your time arguing, and you just won't get anything done. So you need people with a bias towards action. You need people with a bias towards speed, and you need people that are not afraid to make a bunch of mistakes. People grossly overestimate how much a mistake will cost them. That's typical human behavior. Is you tend to, over-index towards like protecting your losses versus, trying to over-index towards your gains. And what I mean by that, for an example, is if you were to lose $10, losing $10 feels much worse than, happiness you would gain if you found $10. Loss aversion is such a basic human trait. And many times, the people that have this aversion to loss, it's been shaped by their backgrounds, right? So in your example, your family business, I think there was like some troubles when you sort of go from a successful business to a not successful business, and you sort of experience loss. It makes you realize that it's not that bad. You just bet on yourself, and then you just keep double down and betting on yourself. It allows you to move faster, take more chances, because you're not as afraid of the losses as you once were. And so I think it's really important to find people that have those things that I mentioned, like a bias for action, a bias for speed. They're not afraid to make mistakes. They're such, basic things. I think most people would say that those are what you should look for. In practice, I don't always observe it happening, though. To move us forward, I think we both have sort of these philosophical views, and a lot of those philosophical views that are shaped by philosophies of other founders. You're an avid reader, but I'm also curious, how does philosophy, and I mean that in the traditional sense, how does philosophy play a role, or how has it played a role in your career?
Yeah, I was a bit of a weird child. So I started reading Stoic philosophy from the time I was young. And I've read a lot of different philosophies. For whatever reason, the school of the Stoics is the one that spoke to me the most. And I think why it resonated was because I was a pretty high anxiety kid. And it's like not something that I realized at the time. I thought it was pretty normal. But as I got older, I reflected a lot more on, who I was as a child. And, you mentioned the fact that like you can go through these business journeys, and I do know what it's like to build a successful business. I know what it's like when all that goes by the wayside and you seriously question, like, am I going to die? And I know that's like a strong word and thought to have. And then you go and you like rebuild the business, and then kind of like that question that you have to ask yourself, like, but did we die? And the answer is like, no. You start to learn that you can persevere and you can survive these things. So I was always searching for like, what's driving this anxiety, this inability to sit still, to want to go out and to accomplish something and to build something. And it was driven into me for sure as a child, not by anything that my parents said. I mean, my dad specifically was very entrepreneurial and always wanted to run his own business. And my dad is no wordsmith by any means. English is his second language, but I watched it through his actions. And I finally started to be able to put names to the feelings that I was having when I started reading Stoic philosophy and really getting into that school, specifically Marcus Aurelius, a lot of work from Seneca. And it was 2,000 years old. And they were talking about a lot of the same concepts that we wrestle with today. And really the core of Stoicism is controlling yourself and focusing on yourself first and controlling your own mindset. And you're talking about a time roughly 2,000 years ago when there was disease and famine and constant war and constant takeover attempts. And you had an individual like Marcus Aurelius, who's the emperor of Rome, who's, effectively the most powerful regime in the world. I mean, even more powerful than, let's say, an American president would be today. Like that level of control. They can point their army in any direction that they want. They can take over any land that they want. And this guy is journaling to himself in his room at night, talking about constraint, talking about treating people with fairness and kindness, talking about the right way to control his own emotions in the day to day. So not to let it get the best of him and to be able to wake up the next morning and go out and have an amazing day. And if you were to really understand the trials and tribulations that he was going through, he was not preaching. He was talking to himself. It wasn't until later that those journals actually became public. But this was a man who was saying, like, take it one day at a time. Do not suffer more than is necessary in advance of what's to come. And I think about that constantly because that is basically life. That is basically life. Some people have more privilege than others. We all start out from different backgrounds, socioeconomic means, different social circles. And then you become an adult and suddenly you've got to find your way in the world and you've got to go out and make the best of it. Or you can fold, you can be a victim, and you could say that my starting place is worse than others, therefore my ending place is going to be worse than others. And I think the same thing can be said about a business. It turns and twists so much and so fast, and no business plan ever starts the way that it should, right? You go back to the early days of what we were doing, and when you first joined us and the team, like, think about the original vision of where we thought we would be 4 or 5 years later. You think you're going to be like on an actual rocket ship to the moon. But in that is COVID and 2 crazy years that you never even thought in a million years, where in no financial model could you have imagined that the world was just going to shut down. Then if you were to know that, even looking back in hindsight, you would say that would be a terrible thing for business. Well, actually, it was a really good thing for digital mortgage companies, terrible thing for society and the world. But everybody started doing things online. And 2020, 2021, and the first half of 2022 were the hottest real estate markets basically ever. Back half of 22 to 23, and maybe just to the start of 2024, were pretty terrible markets. And then we started to get some turnaround and things start looking better. But if you weren't able to control your mindset through that journey, think about how high the highs would have been and how low the lows would have been. So you probably remember me preaching, like, cherish this journey throughout the entire process, because when you look back on this someday, it is a period of your life. You will not remember the finish line, but you will remember the journey, and you will remember the people that you worked with and the relationships that you had along the way. And often I think about you. When I think about that, I think about the team. But I'm going to throw it back at you. You're an individual who thinks a lot about culture and philosophy, and you are an avid reader yourself as well. What has philosophy done for you?
Similar, to yourself, I think Ryan Holiday has done an amazing job bringing Stoic philosophy to the masses. It probably was something that was like sort of buried and no one looked at. And then Ryan Holiday one day sort of like dug it up. He's quite prolific. He starts putting out all these books. And so you get your hands on, a book like The Obstacle is the Way. He's applying philosophy to these different sort of more modern day examples, there's an example of like Thomas Edison, our namesake, when we were Edison Financial. And he talks about how the way that Thomas Edison lived his life was a very stoic approach to living. And so you realize that you can take these principles and these philosophies and apply them to your own life, in both life and in business. And, one of our co-founders, Chad, used to always say, there's no such thing as work life. They're just life. I always encourage people on my team to have these philosophies and have these values. And for the most part, they should be across both business and life. That you shouldn't have these two different sort of philosophies, because as you know, like how you do anything is how you do everything. As I was going through my career when I started, I'd read a lot of Stoic philosophy, but continued to read biographies of founders and sort of develop my own personal philosophy that's like sort of being constantly refined. And I encourage everyone to like write them down. You are going through some of your philosophies on your phone. You should be writing down a list of, whatever it may be, maybe 5 or 10 or 20 different sort of like values that you live by. And for me, it's quotes. Like I'm drawn to quotes.
Yeah, aphorisms.
I love aphorisms. Like the more pithy, the better. It's so amazing that you can take these highly complex thoughts and distill them down into like a few words. I try to read through and see how these people have lived their lives, specifically in biographies or stories about philosophers, and distill that into my own values. And then I take that, and that's how I operate. It's my system for operation, much like a company, a set of isms, like we have in our culture. I sort of have my own set of values that I live by, and I'm constantly refining. It makes it much easier to make decisions if you have a set of principles that you're operating under. And it has done a tremendous amount for me to familiarize myself with both like sort of business philosophy, but also ancient philosophy, specifically Stoic philosophy. I highly encourage, everyone to sort of like dive into it. And like I said, Ryan Holiday is probably the most approachable. Nassim Taleb is another one that I know you also like, Bekim. He's a bit much, he's very arrogant, but
high conviction is how I would describe it.
Very high conviction. People would probably see it as arrogance. And so
it probably is.
It's not for everyone, but it's amazing to go through and read some of his aphorisms, because it helps you think about the world differently. And if we all saw the world, the same sort of narrow way, we wouldn't really be able to disrupt or build a unique and different company. So
yeah, you talk about the power of aphorisms and quotes, and I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. If somebody can take what would be a 1,000-page book and condense it to a single sentence or a single aphorism, to me, that is not, getting off easy. That is a tremendous skill. There's a saying from Mark Twain. I've heard it accredited to other folks in the past, but the one I know is from Mark Twain. I'm sorry I wrote you a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. Something to that effect. I think there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for, I could have taken 4 hours to present to you, and I would have been able to present a really good condensed thought into something you could take away in mere minutes, but I didn't prepare. And I didn't actually go super deep on this topic. I didn't think about the way that I build a team. I didn't think about the way that I build a company. Instead, we're all sort of like learning it as it goes along, many ways wasting time, which is why I think there is value in learning and having done things before, having built companies before. It's like, the starting place. You'd ask me about building a team, building company culture, and my starting place, once I'm, thinking through the who, I sit down and I actually write down the values. My very next exercise, sometimes we'll call them commandments or core philosophies, or at Rocket, we call them isms, but I will actually have a set of those for the company and then for the team and what we're trying to do. And the first thing I'll do is I'll actually get down with the team and actually make it a full exercise with the group and just ask them, what do we believe in? What do we want to stand for? And I find that asking others for their thoughts, right, lending their thoughts, if you will, pun intended on that, they'll start to believe in that stuff and say like, I want to believe in X, Y, and Z, and that's the way I think we should operate. Love that. Let's write that down. Let's get it on the board. Let's scribe it, and let's make it part of what we want to live every single day. And if I'm ever not living that, or if someone else on our team isn't living that, and we identify that as something that's important to us, we're going to call that out. By the way, since we're on the topic, let's make not accepting things that we don't believe in, that we see part of our culture. You guys game with that? Yes. Okay, let's put that on the scribe. That's going to be part of who we are. And we like come to these agreements. And once we come to these agreements, we get them down on paper. That just becomes our operating model in the day to day. And we revisit those. We revisit those every 6, 12 months and say, is this still who we are? Is this still what we believe in? And having the ability to adjust them through time, I think, is important too. You know, it's the reason why even in scripture, there are New Testaments, right? Is sometimes you go back and you look at these things and you go, you know, society has changed. The reason why there are amendments to the Constitution, if you will, or to bills, and you go out and you just build your culture. And culture is a living and breathing thing, and philosophy and values are living, breathing things. And it's something that I really give a lot of thought to as I walk every day and every night. And when I do, oftentimes I'm thinking about business problems, but I'm also just thinking about culture and values.
Yeah, to save Mark Twain here, I think it was, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one.
Oh, so good.
You know, you were talking about the ability to like distill those companies' sort of philosophies and those complex thoughts into these pithy sayings. And in many ways, you know, Twitter was great for that, or X, where people like, they were forced to express things in a character limit.
Oh, I missed the character limit.
And is there no character limit anymore?
No.
You can write as long of a tweet as you want?
Maybe there's some character limit. I have to assume there's like some maximum, but it's, I mean, you can go on X today, there's just novels.
Well, that was like, I think that's what made X or Twitter so effective. It's just like, you know, you have all these people providing their thoughts in the most concise manner possible. Same thing with news, right? Like it's a much better way to consume information, and it forced you to think about, how am I going to say this in such a concise way? In many ways, company emails should also have character limits. Which I think we've had, you know, I sometimes like go through my email, I'm like, I'm not reading this. You sort of start to understand.
Thank God for AI.
Yeah. Anyone writing an email that you have to scroll should really pop that into AI and ask it to be more concise. But there's a real skill there. And I think your company would be much better for it. Everyone is condensing their own thoughts. So we talked a lot about team. We talked a lot about culture and company philosophy. What are some actual takeaways you have for anyone trying to build a team? Maybe it's a mortgage broker that's looking to go out on their own and build a team around them, or someone that's looking to, you know, start a business in the mortgage or lending space. What advice would you give to them about building their team?
I believe that, to pull in an aphorism here, a team takes on the identity of its leader. You've probably heard me say that thousands of times in our years of working together now.
We look the same. Look.
Yeah. A team takes on the identity of its leader. And what that means is that people don't actually care what you say. They watch what you do. And your team will slowly become that over time. If you show up late, you cannot expect your team to show up on time every day. If you are somebody who does not, you know, respond to emails on weekends, for anything, you cannot expect your team to respond to emails on weekends. Your team will not care what you say. They will watch what you do. Leadership is not something that you do to your team. It is something that you do with your team, to quote the late, great Stephen Luigi Piazza, a former colleague of mine. And people will watch what you do. So when I think about building a team, the biggest takeaway is think about who you are first, write down the values, and like actually be honest with yourself. Like, don't say that I'm somebody who believes in X, Y, and all these other things, if that's not actually what you live every single day, because your team will sniff that out so fast. People are smart. People can feel things. They're intuitive. And if you're out there trying to portray that you are somebody you're not, then your team will pick that up. Like, I think people make the mistake, for instance, of trying to be Steve Jobs after reading a Jobs biography, for example. And they'll be like, I'm going to have an insanely high talent bar. I'm going to have an insanely high level of density for design, for example. But if you don't have a great eye for design and you are willing to let things pass without it going through a very, very rigorous design process, you cannot and you will not be Steve Jobs. Well, first of all, the odds of being Steve Jobs are quite low to begin with. But truthfully, like, everyone has their own Steve Jobs thing that they as an individual human being, I believe this, can be uniquely phenomenal at and be the best in the world at. Try to identify what that is. Write down what that is. Write down what those values are. Think about who you know or who you can find that may embody those values as well. Scribe those values and then live those values every single day. And if you see yourself getting off those values, creating a culture that allows your team to tell you that you are fading on those values, or having a culture that allows you to tell anybody on your team that they're not living up to those values in a very honest way, in a very kind way, as I like to say, without feelings being hurt. That to me is how you build a strong team. It's how you build a strong culture. It's how you build a strong company, because all a company is at the end of the day is a group of individuals who come together for a common mission. And if you can work together and you can work together well enough, I truly believe that human beings in a group working hard can solve almost all of society's problems. And if you can't do it today, then just give it time and keep working at it, and you will soon enough figure it out. But as we've done many times here, I'm going to throw this one back at you. We've talked a lot about philosophy and culture. I've told you some of my beliefs, which we share, and you say they're contrarian, but we agree. So we agree on the 80%. I'm going to ask you a question. Is there a 20% of, maybe my beliefs or anything that I've said that you disagree with, Chris?
I don't know if anything that you've said thus far I've disagreed with. One thing I want to add, however, is I've talked a lot about being fast, and one area I think you should be slow in is in your hiring. There's a saying which is hire slow, fire fast. And one thing that I've personally observed is how detrimental it could be to let, B and C players into your organization, especially early on. When you're early on, you have the ability to have an incredibly high talent density. You should only have A players for a while. I don't know what the number is, but let's say at least your first 50 people should all be A players. And Steve Jobs talks about like Pixar was one of the greatest places he worked because they somehow found a way to get 700 A players in a room. And that was really the magic of Pixar, was just this insanely high talent density. And so when you identify someone on your team that is not living these philosophies and it's become apparent, you can't move fast enough. You have to get that person off the bus. Any thought that you could save these people, and again, this is a controversial opinion that I have, which is that I don't think it is worthwhile trying to turn B players into A players. I think your time is better suited finding A players. So slowing down, making sure that you're making the right hires. And then if you do mishire, which is inevitably going to happen, you have to get those people off the bus as fast as you humanly can. There's a great saying, which is when there's doubt, there's no doubt. If you have any doubt in this person, you probably should just pull the trigger, because your best people, you never have doubt. You never doubt those like few people that are on your team. Like there's no question in your mind you would get rid of them, or that, if they would ever leave, you would do everything you could to save them. If that's not the case for someone, they're probably not maybe worthwhile keeping, especially if you're early on. Now, inevitably, your business grows. It's a reality as you scale, but you should try to have the highest talent densities you can for as long as you possibly can.
I think that's really well said. What I've often found is like those people, they may be B players in your organization or C players in your organization, but you take that same skill set and you apply it to another company, they're A players there.
That's right.
And over the years, I have built teams and torn teams down and built and rebuilt. And what I found is most of the people that I was really candid with and really honest and told them that I didn't think it was working out. Well, first of all, we had a culture that most of them would just self-select and say, like, this isn't for me. When I run into those people, sometimes months or in some cases years and years later, most of them I have fantastic relationships with. They are extremely grateful. They're doing so well. They're thankful for the time that they spent at the company, and they got why it just didn't work. And we didn't hide from that. I didn't run from that. They didn't run from that. We think we're doing the right thing by protecting someone, that's the nice thing to do. The kind thing to do is to let people know where they stand, never surprise someone in some performance review, but rather to give the feedback every day to say, this work isn't up to my standard or the standard of this organization. I need you to get there, and I need you to get there fast. Otherwise, I have to find somebody else who can help us get this done, because we're on a mission and I need somebody who's going to help me get there. And people will appreciate that. And guess who's going to appreciate that more than anybody, Chris? Your A players.
Mm-hmm.
Your best people who are most bought in, whose exact skill set aligns to the work being done. Those are the people that, if you don't hold an extremely high standard in your culture and in your organization, it's not long before those people become disincentivized, disenchanted with what's going on, and they start to self-select themselves out. And if you're losing your A players, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. So this has been a great conversation.
Great.
We talk a lot about mortgages. I don't know that we said the word mortgage until just now.
I think I said rocket mortgage a couple times. But
Okay.
Yeah, right. We didn't.
Good. We didn't even get into mortgages because we're running out of time here. But we talked a lot about philosophy. We talked a lot about culture and team building. And I think that when it comes to lending and mortgages and brokering and technology in the real estate space and all the things that we actually focus on day to day, it's just as important to talk about culture and philosophy and who you are and what you want to be, because that's ultimately what's going to drive the success of your organization. So thanks for interviewing me.
Thank you.
Thanks for the t-shirt.
Yeah.
As well.
Bringing the MF loans.
Much appreciated. And we'll see you soon.
Cheers.